Mounce, BBG, chapter 14, sentence 5. This sentence has probably two things that are probably strange or unusual to you, and then one other thing, of course, which we need to figure out. But just to give you a helpful hint, as we've done before, the best thing you could probably do is yank the relative clause out of the sentence, make sure the rest of the sentence makes sense without the relative clause. In this particular instance, the relative clause is the entire end of the sentence. And then, he gives you the verb, and then you have hora, which is a nominative singular feminine, an hour. So, indefinite. So we're going to just say an hour comes. And again, that sentence does make perfect sense without anything else there. An hour comes. That's, period. In this case, they're going to tell you about that hour. And that hour is an hour in which, and there's your relative pronoun, which happens to follow a preposition, which tells you why it has to be in the dative, why you have to have that iota subscript, because it's the object of the preposition. While it does govern the entire relative clause, it still is the object of a preposition, so it has to be in that case. All right? So in which, Pontes you recognize as all, and hopefully you recognize that as nominative plural, third declension word. So the first problem that you're going to run into, though, an hour comes in which all, and then you have this phrase, and what introduces it is this definite article with no noun following it. And you may or may not have noticed Mounce's note on this, and this happens quite often in Greek, where you have a definite article followed by a prepositional phrase, and what he tells you to do is to turn that into a relative clause itself, in which case you'd say something like, an hour comes in which all who are in the tombs. And that's perfectly acceptable. I would tell you that in terms of, sticking with something that's more obvious to your mind, if you can take that definite article and treat it as though it has a noun in it, as though it is something more than it is, one of the things you can do is just say all the ones. So an hour comes in which all the ones in the tombs. So this, while it is a definite article, it's really presenting you with more information than just a definite article. It's doing more than that in this particular instance. So all the people, all the ones, all those, any of those three would work to tell you, I like all the ones because you still have the definite article built into that, but then you're saying that it represents more than that within the clause. So you play with it as you wish, but the idea there is that it's very common in Greek to have a definite article introducing a prepositional phrase, and then you got to play with it one of two ways, either Mounce's relative clause itself, or, like I said, just treat the definite article as something more, and that way you can kind of stick with it as is. And an hour comes in which all the ones in the tombs, and then he gives you the verb here, will hear. And then you have the second funny thing that happens is, you're looking at this and voice or sound, right? But the trick here is that everything's in the genitive. You got all these genitive singulars. So your tendency might be to say something like, all the ones in the tombs will hear of the voice of him, or of his voice. But the deal is, and the trick you need to know is that if you remember, we talked about verbs of communication and cognition often taking their direct object in the dative. Well, it just so turns out that the verb akuo, which is I hear, which is the verb you have here, takes its definite article, guess what, in the genitive. So essentially what that means to you is you're going to treat this as the direct object. Even though it's genitive, you're going to translate it as the direct object because akuo is one of those collocation rules. Akuo can, not always, but it can take its direct object in the genitive. And again, it's called a genitive of direct object. So the voice of him is the way you'd want to translate it. And you could say, well, hear his voice, of course. And I'm happy with either translation. You can play with that either way you like. So an hour comes in which all the ones in the tombs will hear the voice of him, or an hour comes in which all the ones in the tombs will hear his voice. Either one of those will work just fine.